Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pella, and thanks for being with us. Today I'm joined by Ryan Byrne for our monthly dive into ballot measure history. Each month, you can expect us to take a magnifying glass to a different state as part of our historical ballot measure factbook project, which will document nearly 200 years of direct democracy in the United States and states all across the country. We've completed 8 of these fact books so far. We're moving our way slowly towards all 50 states. So today, let's zoom in on Ohio. We talk a lot about Ohio's current ballot measure landscape on this show. The Buckeye State is often a home to many of the most competitive and attention-grabbing ballot measures. But today, we're going to ignore the present, take a look back at the past and history. So Ryan, thanks for coming on the show. Let's dig in.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Yeah, Ohio is always a fun and exciting state.
You bet. Let's have some fun here. So Ohio has had a long and active history when it comes to ballot measures. Give our listeners a quick rundown of the types of ballot measures Ohio allows, and just some basic numbers when it comes to what we've seen when we finish crunching all of the data for Ohio.
Yeah, so just to start with the basics, our data goes back to 1910, which is a really appropriate starting point. If we can't start at statehood, 1910 is a good one. And the reason for that is that voters in 1910 approved a ballot measure calling for a state constitutional convention, which led to Ohio's current constitution. So since 1910, the state has had 306 ballot measures, and about two-thirds of those were legislative referrals, so measures from the Ohio General Assembly. And about one-third of those were citizen-initiated measures. And in Ohio, voters can collect signatures to place issues on the ballot, whether it's constitutional amendments, state statutes, or veto referendums, which allow voters to reject recently passed laws. So in Ohio, legislatively referred measures have been approved nearly 70% of the time, while citizen-initiated measures have passed just 26% of the time, which is really not all that unusual between legislative measures and citizen-initiated ones, but 26% is still pretty low. Most states see initiative approval rates in the 30 to 40% range.
So looking at those historical trends, Ohio saw major peaks in activity in the 1910s and 1970s. And one of the things that we found so interesting as we've dug into the data so far in this project is how each state has had different arcs for when they've seen most of their activity. But for Ohio, what was going on in the 1910s and 1970s? What were the kind of themes that led to surges in those decades?
Yeah, so, as I just mentioned, 1910, voters approved a measure to convene a state constitutional convention, which ultimately resulted in the adoption of a new state constitution. When states do this, sometimes they just put the whole state constitution on the ballot as one ballot measure, up or down vote on the whole thing. However, Ohio's convention did not do that. Instead, they presented it as 42 separate amendments. So, one of these amendments established the initiative and referendum process. So voters were deciding on 42 amendments in 1912, and then following the adoption of initiative and referendum, straight out the door, initiatives gained a lot of traction. So between 1913 and 20, Ohio voters considered 20 more initiatives. So the whole convention following 1910, the 1912 convention, really pushed that decade into having a high number of ballot measures. So the 1970s saw a similar increase in constitutional amendments, though the reason perhaps is not as immediately obvious. Unlike in 1910, there was no state constitutional convention. Instead, these amendments were introduced by the legislature primarily. So, why did that happen? Right before the 1970s, in 1969, the legislature passed a bill to establish not a convention, but the Ohio Constitutional Revision Commission, which existed from 70 to 77. It reviewed and proposed changes to the state constitution, really with this goal of modernizing the Constitution. Modernizing is still a subjective word, and there was plenty of contentious things that came out of that. But legislators were then responsible of, deciding whether to put these amendments on the ballot or not from the commission. And they put a good number on the ballot, causing another increase in the 70s.
So just a little break from Ohio for a second. There have been a lot of ballot measures like this over the years where, these really in-depth analyses of state constitutions and revamping them and, just long drawn out, discussions about what should that constitution look like? How should it change? But I don't think that happens as much anymore, it seems like. Like, over the last 20 years, is this kind of gone away in the states? Just it's not just Ohio now for this part of the discussion. Does this sort of thing happen anymore where, voters get a chance to look at 40 measures just to redo a whole state's constitution? Or did something change over the last 20 or 30 years and this has kind of, gone away a little bit?
Yeah, I think that is a correct observation. So states still regularly decide on state constitutional conventions. A lot of states, they're automatic questions, including in Ohio, where every so often voters are asked the question, should we hold a state constitutional convention? Voters have overwhelmingly really rejected these in recent decades. The most recent one was actually, I think, Rhode Island in 1984 when voters approved a question. So, yeah, it's definitely the case that voters have not approved as many state constitutional convention questions in recent history. We haven't really seen any big new constitutional changes in terms of the whole document. The most recent one was actually just a couple years ago in Alabama, but even then, they considered it a new constitution, but it was really just reorganizing the existing constitution and removing some inoperative parts.
Well, we'll have to do a whole episode on state constitutional conventions and why they have gone the way of the disposable camera and had to figure out a little more into that. So let's get back to Ohio then. So, what else was pretty interesting about the 1912 Constitutional Convention that you were referring to earlier?
Yeah, so in researching ballot measures, we've learned a lot about state constitutional conventions, but Ohio's 1912 conventions always stood out to me. It had very clear and strong ties to, I think, as we discussed in our last discussion about Wisconsin, to the populist and progressive movements of the early 1900s. So the convention president was Herbert Bigelow. He was actually a Cincinnati minister and longtime like initiative and referendum advocate. Several national leaders spoke at the convention. William Jennings Bryan, who represented the more populist wing of the Democratic Party at the time, spoke in favor of the initiative and referendum. And of course, there was a really big name in the House, former President Theodore Roosevelt, who was gearing up to challenge incumbent President William Howard Taft for the Republican nomination, spoke at the convention with a really long address called A Charter of Democracy. I'm going to read a short excerpt from it just because I think it's so interesting to read kind of these historical initiative and referendum ideas. So here's Roosevelt. We are engaged in one of the great battles of the age, a long contest waged against privilege on behalf of the common welfare. We hold it a prime duty of the people to free our government from the control of money and politics. For this purpose, we advocate not as ends in themselves, but as weapons in the hands of the people. That is a reference to initiative and referendum. All governmental devices which will make the representatives of the people more easily and certainly responsible to the people's will. So here's Roosevelt really sticking out for the initiative and referendum process, challenging Taft on his home turf of Ohio, gearing up for the Republican nomination, which of course Roosevelt ended up losing and then running with the new party, his progressive party, also known as the Bull Moose Party. So all really interesting stuff, how this all ties together.
Yeah, well, you really should have read that in your best Robin Williams Night at the Museum accent. That would have really stuck the landing. But I'll still give you a 9 for the excerpt and the quote. It's such a really, compelling point, that something we've brought up on the show before, that, major national political figures really don't weigh in much on the general INR process anymore, which wasn't the case in the early 20th century when it was really prominently part of campaign appearances and sort of stances and platforms. So let's move on though a little bit and talk about Ohio again, and how its voters have considered 13 different ballot measures that directly affect the ballot measure process itself. So tell us, what are some of the more notable ones and how do they end up shaping the system that Ohio has today?
Yes, this really varies by state, but the initiative and referendum process is typically a constitutional power. So as a result, certain changes, especially big changes, require more constitutional amendments, which must be decided through ballot measures. And I think from doing a number of write-ups on ballot measures, we've seen that readers generally are find this really fascinating, this idea of ballot measures about ballot
Meta,
measures.
very meta.
Beyond 1912, obviously that would be the most significant one. People actually established the initiative and referendum process. Some of the other significant ones, sticking in 1912, a lot happened in 1912 in Ohio. Voters also approved an amendment changing the approval requirement for constitutional amendments. Before 1912, it needed a simple majority of all votes cast in the election, which means not casting a vote was equivalent to a no. And instead, it just required of all votes cast on that particular measure. So if your vote was blank, doesn't matter. So that was one pretty big change that allowed for a lot more constitutional amendments to pass. And voters have been asked multiple times to change the signature requirement for ballot initiatives, but each time it was rejected. It actually wasn't until 2008 that voters approved any kind of significant change to the initiative process. In 2008, they approved an amendment that moved the signature submission deadline from 90 days before the election to 125 days before the election, so effectively shifting it from early August to early July. And really, one of the biggest changes proposed by the legislature in recent years that voters decided on was just in 2023 when voters rejected a constitutional amendment to establish a 60% voter requirement for constitutional amendments. So, I think there's always been this push and pull, as we can see across time, between legislators and the initiative process. And in Ohio, at least, when voters have been asked to change the constitutional aspects of the initiative process, they've largely chosen to keep it as it is.
So let's talk a little bit about the different ballot measures that have occurred over the years. And, how many was it again? How many Ohio ballot measures or do we have in the database?
Yeah, so back to 1910, we have 306.
Okay. So of the 306, we've looked through them, we've got them all tagged, categorized, sorted through. So then we've pull out the ones we think are the most fascinating, most fun stories to tell. So we're gonna take the time now on the show to just talk through a few of those. So I'm just gonna kind of list one, you tell us about it. So tell us about the 1919 referendum on the 18th Amendment. What was that all about?
Just the year prior, in 1918, voters approved a citizen initiated constitutional amendment to allow veto referendums on the General Assembly's actions regarding the ratification of federal constitutional amendments. In other words, if the Assembly voted to ratify a U.S. constitutional amendment, voters could veto that action, at least in theory. Voters put this power to use right away in 1919. The state legislature voted to ratify the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was the federal prohibition of alcohol. A veto referendum was filed to overturn this action. Voters actually narrowly overturned it, just 479 votes out of 1 million.
Wow, I was close.
So, nothing like this ever happened before. Voters overturned the legislature's ratification of a U.S. constitutional amendment.
So the legislature is saying we want to prohibit alcohol, and the voters of the state said, "No, no, wait a second, we don't want you to do that."
Yeah, exactly.
And by 400 and something votes, they narrowly tried to overrule the legislature and say, "No, no, we Ohioans still want to drink." But then what happened?
Yeah, so a lawsuit was filed. First, the Ohio Supreme Court, which upheld the veto referendum, and then it was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which held that veto referendums on federal constitutional amendments were invalid under the U.S. Constitution. The order said that the ratification of a federal constitutional amendment is not legislation, but rather the state's expression of assent. So while a state's power to legislate comes from its people, the authority to ratify federal amendments comes from the U.S. Constitution. In other words, federal amendments follow federal rules. Veto referendums are a state power. They can't apply to federal rules. So really fascinating, measure and Supreme Court case there.
Yeah, it had a pretty significant impact then because I imagine there would have been times in future years where citizens might have wanted to do a veto referendum over something that a state legislature did, but this essentially was the precedent. It's been a little more than 100 years since that ballot measure. Let's go to a sort of a different topic, food and soda taxes. So what are some food and soda tax measures that have appeared before Ohio voters?
Yeah, so, I think I wanted to call this one out because soda taxes at least kind of seem like a relatively new trend emerging in the late 2000s, at least based on our coverage of local ballot measures. It's when we kind of saw them start to pop up. However, this measure was obviously from 1994, so kind of like a decade earlier. It was actually 2 years earlier in 1992, the legislature had passed a tax on soft drinks, but soon after, opponents responded by proposing and passing a constitutional amendment to prohibit it. Ohio kind of has a long history of this, going all the way back to, again, jumping back a few decades to 1934, when the assembly enacted the state's first sales tax. The first sales tax exempted milk and bread, but all other foods were taxable. Obviously, this is around the time of the Great Depression. Taxing food for home consumption was, well, unpopular. So, in response, voters approved the 1936 citizen-initiated amendment that banned taxes on off-premise food consumption with 70% of the vote then. So, restaurants, stuff like that there could still be taxes on that food, but anything that people took home, no taxes.
Is that part of a broader trend in the state's history, or is it reflected in any way in the current measure landscape?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, we see a lot of ballot measures about taxes, and we see a lot of ballot measures about prohibiting certain types of taxes, and usually around things like that. In recent years, we have seen ballot measures addressing other things for human consumption. South Dakota actually just voted on this in 2024 on prohibiting taxes on anything sold for human consumption. Voters actually rejected it, with 70% voting against it. I think there the concern was, or what you saw with people opposing it is that they thought, well, if we eliminate this tax, they're going to increase taxes on something else, right? Which sometimes is something that, people consider, right? When they're voting on a ballot measures, if we block taxes on one thing, how will it affect taxes on other things?
I'm going to lightning around now through some other ballot measures that we've got in our database. And I'm just going to say the name and the year and the topic and let you riff on it a little bit, Ryan. So prepare yourself. 1958, voters in Ohio rejected a right to work law. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, you read it out. They rejected a right to work law, and I think what it's another one where we still kind of talk about it, right? Like we talk about right to work bills, we talk about right to work ballot measures, but right to work has been an issue with ballot measures for gosh, well, I think since the 50s. Ohio was one of the earlier ones, but we saw them throughout the states in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on. So it's definitely not a new topic by any means.
1976, constitutional amendment related to joint tickets. What's that about? Did they approve it?
Right. So in 1976, voters actually approved a constitutional amendment to provide that the lieutenant governor and governor run as a joint ticket. And there's actually just 9 states where the gubernatorial candidate runs on a single ticket with the lieutenant governor that they pick.
All right, next, Ryan, let's turn to 1976 when voters approved a constitutional amendment that has to do with elections. What happened?
Yeah, this actually happened across a number of states. A number of states enacted ballot measures for congressional term limits. However, kind of like going back to that 1919 amendment, the US Supreme Court ruled that this was a federal issue and that ballot measures are state legislation and state legislation could not order term limits on congressional members. So it's actually kind of similar logic. Of course, I think this one, people are interested in having the US Supreme Court revisit it. So we'll see what happens in the future.
As we have sort of covered on this show and in other shows, oftentimes voters approve a ballot measure and it gets enacted and then could get later overturned by court decisions. Another one of those happened in 1992 with respect to term limits. So
Correct.
what happened in Ohio?
But they're still in the books.
Sorry?
So if the Supreme Court ever did change its, change precedent there, they would probably go into effect.
Well, right, and that's another part of an interesting part of ballot measures that we've talked about on a number of topics over the years. Sometimes a state can have a law in the books that is sort of essentially ready to go should any kind of federal court ruling change. We've seen that with, say, abortion or marijuana over the years. Well, let's talk about 1994, a ballot measure that became kind of a foreground for a number of other measures like it.
Yeah, so in 1994, voters in Ohio actually approved a constitutional amendment to create a crime victims bill of rights. And a number of states did that in the 90s. And then there was kind of a newer proposed version, which is typically referred to as Marsy's Law, that popped up later. And actually, 12 states have adopted Marsy's Law kind of over the 2010s.
Well, what other ballot measures in history stand out to you? Do we cover everything, or did we miss one that you particularly wanted to make sure our listeners knew about?
Well, I could keep going on about 1912, but I think enough people have heard about that, though. You can come check out our website and look at our Ohio 1912 ballot measures. There's definitely some incredibly fascinating ones. And really, I think something that's worth noting too is like how many big topic ballot initiatives Ohio has had in recent years, whether it's like marijuana or abortion. Ohio has continued, as we said at the start of this call, to make a lot of noise.
Yeah, it's been a very nationally covered state, I suppose you could say, and not just in even years. They have a number of odd year ballot measures as well, which in some respects can kind of amplify the coverage to the state. And you're right, Ryan. Our ballot measure page, which you'll find in the show notes, has a searchable database, and you can explore and play around with the data to your heart's content and have some fun poking around. What's the next ballot measure we're going to add to our collection? It's coming up in May, and once that one is done, it'll enter into the historical archives of our website. So what's coming up in May?
Yeah, so the next Ohio ballot measure, state ballot measure, is on May 6th, and voters will decide on a constitutional amendment to allow the state to issue up to $2.5 billion in bonds to really assist local governments in funding kind of like local infrastructure projects. And it's actually related to a state program, and the state has continuously replenished this program with bond measures. So every decade, voters have voted since the 80s on a bond measure related to this program. And well, they've all passed. In 2005, it came a little bit close, 54%, but all the other ones were between 60 and 70%. So we'll see what happens this time. It had unanimous support in the legislature from Democrats and Republicans, but yeah, it's number 307 since 1910.
Bond measures are one of the most common types of ballot measures out there. Well, we'll look forward to having you back on the show again, Ryan, to dig into another state sometime next month. Thanks for being here.
As always, thank you.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our historical ballot measure fact books in our show notes. We'll be back later this week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Halley, and thanks for listening.